For those of you who don't know me, like Chrissy said, my name is Joey Balfour, and I am the curator of oral history at the National World War II Museum. Um, Memorial Day is a very special holiday, especially for those of us at the National World War II Museum. Today, when we honor the sacrifices of the men and women in uniform who sacrificed themselves for this country and for the freedoms that we have today. So this morning, we're going to be looking at a handful of oral history clips from the Battle of Attu. But since we're looking at them on Memorial Day, instead of just showing clips of these guys talking about the battle, I also want to look at the human cost as they experienced it. On June 3rd and 4th, 1942, Japanese naval and air forces attacked the American military installations at Dutch Harbor and Fort Mears, Alaska. A day before these attacks start, a day before the Battle of Midway begins. A few days later, Japanese ground forces land on and occupy the islands of Kiska and Attu in the Western Aleutians. But why were the Aleutians so attractive to the Japanese? Why would they care enough about that part of the world to want to attack these American military installations and then occupy islands in the Western Aleutians? The Aleutian Islands, Attu in particular, as we're going to hear from a couple of these guys, are some of the most inhospitable places on Earth. On a good day, the weather in the Aleutians is pretty poor by most common standards. The islands are typically covered in fog that can get so thick it can restrict visibility to less than a foot. I have interviewed guys over the years who served in the Aleutians, both during the Battle of Attu and then at other times during the war, who talked about standing in waist-deep fog and not even being able to see their feet. On top of that, the Aleutian Islands experience a weather phenomenon known as a willowaw. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with the term, a willowaw is an Aleutians hurricane that can whip up out of nowhere. They produce rain and sleet and snow, of course, but they can also produce winds, sustained winds in excess of 100 miles an hour. As if that's not frightening enough that these storms can whip up out of nowhere and produce sustained winds of more than 100 miles an hour, willowaws can last for minutes or they can last for weeks. So think about that. That's like having a Category 2 hurricane sitting in one spot for weeks. In weather like that, life shuts down, much less military operations. So you can't function in weather like that. So what made these islands so attractive? Why did the Japanese need them? And the answer to that is somewhat twofold. First off, the Aleutian Islands, or most of the Aleutian Islands, are American territory. And the Japanese were well aware that if they could occupy American territory, it would be a pretty significant blow to the morale of the American people, if the American people knew about it. Unfortunately for the Japanese, their occupation of the Aleutian Islands was not very widespread, or knowledge of their occupation was not very widespread. But still, prior to the Japanese landing on and occupying Attu and Kiska, the last time enemy troops occupied American territory was when the British were in the United States during the War of 1812, 130 years before the Japanese got to Attu and Kiska. Second, the Aleutian Islands are a backdoor into the United States for the Japanese, or a backdoor into Japan for, backdoor into the United States for Japan, and backdoor into Japan for the United States. If you look at a map of the Aleutian Islands, could you put up slide 1, please? So if we look at a map of the Aleutian Islands, we can see that they are essentially stepping stones between North America and Japan. In fact, Attu is over 1,000 miles closer to Tokyo than it is to San Francisco. So either nation looking to launch a ground offensive into the other's territory could use the Aleutian Islands as a springboard. The Aleutian Islands could also be used to house airfields that could be used for launching air attacks into one or the other's territory. And they could be used as a shield to block attacks coming from one direction or the other. You can take that slide down now, please. So as a bit of an aside, some believe that the Japanese Aleutian Islands operation from June 3rd to 8th, 1942 was simply meant to be a distraction from their primary objective, which was the island of Midway. The Japanese knew if they could occupy Midway, then they would be in a position to threaten Hawaii, and that would give them pretty strong bargaining power if peace negotiations just came up, or it would give them a springboard for them to use to attack Hawaii. It's certainly possible that the Aleutians operation was just a diversion, but I kind of think that that's not the case. I think it's more so that it was a tandem operation of nearly equal importance, as for the reasons that I've explained just now. So even though this battle, the Battle of Attu and the Aleutian Islands, aren't as well known as, say, Peleliu or the Battle of the Bulge, these were significant events during World War II, and quite possibly may have been one of the bigger disasters militarily that Japan experienced during the war. After all, if the two carriers that they had sent to the Aleutian Islands had been at Midway, the Battle of Midway may have turned out different. The course of the entire Pacific War may have turned out different. We just don't know. But it's something to think about. So the Japanese occupy Kiska in the early morning hours of June 7th, 1942. Within a few hours, they attack the 10-man U.S. Navy weather station there, capture 9 of the 10 quickly. A couple are wounded. The detachment commander, who is aerographer's mate, First Class William House, escapes out into the tundra, stays out on the run for quite some time. Then on July 28th, 42, he, as a result of being hungry, dehydrated, no doubt tired of freezing in that lovely Aleutian Islands weather, surrenders to the Japanese after being on the lam for 50 days. A few hours after they land on Kiska, a Japanese landing force goes ashore on Attu at Massacre Bay, right around the same place that the 7th Infantry Division lands one of its landing forces almost a year later. The Japanese make their way to Attu village, which takes the better part of a day, even though it's only about a 4-mile trip from Massacre Bay to Attu village, as the crow flies. The reason for that is that, like the Americans are going to experience 11 months later when they land, the Japanese maps are pretty poor. The weather is really bad. Again, imagine that. Bad weather is going to be a recurring theme here. And many of the Japanese troops just got lost in the fog as they were heading to Attu village. When they do reach Attu village, they find the island's only inhabitants, 39 native Unangan, which is what the native Aleutian Islanders refer to themselves as. They don't refer to themselves as Aleuts. They find 39 native Unangans, an older American couple. This older couple, Charles Foster Jones and his wife Etta Jones, are on the island as missionaries. Even though Foster Jones does send regular weather reports out via radio to the U.S. Navy, Etta Jones is a school teacher and a nurse. Well, the Japanese promptly round up the 39 Unangans and Etta Jones. They kill Foster Jones. Then they put their captives on a ship, send them to Japan, where they spend the rest of the war as internees. Roughly half of the Unangans die in Japan while they're being interned and never return home. Actually, none of the Unangans returned to their original home because none of them were allowed to go back to Attu after the war. But the Japanese then set up defenses around Chichagof Harbor, which is where they set up their main base, and then in the hills overlooking Massacre Bay, and they sit back and wait for the Americans to get there. In May of 43, the United States is coming to retake Attu and Kiska. The original plan was for Kiska to be invaded first. That plan was changed, and Attu became the initial target. The plan for the recapture of Attu called for the landing of 2 forces: the Southern Landing Force, which landed at Massacre Bay on the south side of Attu, the Northern Landing Force, which landed at Red Beach near Holtz Bay on the northern side of the island. The Southern Landing Force was the primary assault force and the larger of the 2. Both of the infantrymen that we will be hearing from today landed at Massacre Bay with the Southern Landing Force. Our 3rd veteran this morning, who is an engineer, also landed at Massacre Bay, but he went ashore after the initial invasion. Could we put up slide 2, please? And just a note here, we will be showing multiple clips of these interviews, as well as a couple of, okay, you can stay up, as well as a couple of produced pieces. The produced pieces, just so that everybody's aware, the cut clips are just clips of interviews. The produced pieces are actually produced pieces with archival footage added and some narration. So back to the map. So the American plan was for the northern and southern landing forces to land, fight their way inland to the area around Prendergast Ridge. They're then going to turn northeast and drive towards Chichagof Harbor, which is where the primary Japanese fortifications are and headquarters are located. Of course, before an army can advance inland, it first has to get onto the beach. When the invasion force arrives off Attu, the weather was terrible and the landings were postponed for several days. Okay, the slide can come down now, please. The 7th Division was supposed to land on May 7th, but the landings were postponed until May 11th. Even once troops are in their landing craft in the early morning hours of May 11th and waiting to go ashore, landings are still delayed as a result of the fog. This brings me to the first oral history clip that we're going to see. This is William S. Jones of Company G, 17th Infantry Regiment, and he's going to be talking about the landings being delayed because of the weather, as well as witnessing the first casualties suffered on Attu, even though the landings were unopposed. So if we could play video clip number 1.
And we got in our, we the front line people, got in our boats somewhere around 6 o'clock in the morning. We'd had our steak and eggs for breakfast on board ship, and we got in our landing craft around 6 o'clock in Massacre Bay, and then we circled, and we were supposed to land at 8:20 in the morning, and we landed at 4:20 in the afternoon because of the fog. They couldn't find the beach. So finally, from what I've heard from 2 or 3 sources or read it myself, remember, as I talked to you, I was a private when I landed on the beach, and at that grade and level, you hardly ever get the big picture, you know. A few days later, I was a sergeant squad leader, but even there, you don't get the big picture. But anyhow, they finally found a small ship out in our armada that had basic radar. So they called him in, and he came in and pointed to the beach, and the control officer, naval control officer, had us lined up at a hypothetical 500 yards from the beach, and we took off to the beach and landed around, pardon me, to the best of my knowledge and things that I've read, it's been around 4:20 in the afternoon. Going into the beach, it was quite foggy. The average landing craft, the Higgins boat that we used in that craft at that landing, is about 30 foot long, and the coxswain, of course, steers from the rear, and it's got a gate on the front that drops, and we run out of there and into the enemy fire, if there is such a thing, if they met us on the beach. Thank the Lord, in this instance, they didn't meet us on the beach, and we didn't get fired upon at all landing. But on the way in, we were flying. We had a boat 10 or 12 foot, as I recall, 10 or 12 feet to my left, and we were full speed ahead. Once that Navy control officer gives the signal to leave and go, they push the throttle forward, and we go as fast as we can, actually, to get there and get under cover. And that's starting at around 500 yards from the beach. And as we were going in, I happened to glance over to the left, and another landing craft 10 or 12 foot from us hit this rock that was out there. The coxswain 30 foot away didn't see this, couldn't see this. That's how foggy it was. And he thought he'd hit the beach, and he hit the lever that drops the gate in the front. Well, the inertia of, hitting it like that, everybody went like this, and when they backed off, when the boat floated back, why, they lost several men. I had no idea what, because we were going, we went on past them. They were probably the first Army casualties of Attu. And then we landed, as I said, unopposed, and at least we got ourselves organized on the beach, and our unit integrity was maintained, and we were able to function as we should as the organization that we were formed into. And from then on, we were just progressively went into battle and eliminated the enemy as we went along, and they thought it would take us 36 hours. It took us 19 days.
So as we can see, just getting ashore on Attu was extremely difficult. And things just got worse from there. Within a couple of hours, the men of both landing forces are making their way inland. Troops move across the valley floors and attack in the ridges above. Attu and the other Aleutian Islands are strings of volcanic islands, so they're all mountains and valleys and mountains and valleys. There are very few areas on the islands where they're just flat plains. There's also no vegetation on the islands, which we'll hear about here shortly soon. But a couple of days after going ashore, Jones and his men assault a ridge referred to or known as the Hogback. A lot of the ridges whose names we're going to hear were named after the battle. They did not have names at the time of the battle because a survey done prior to the war only measured in a certain distance from the beach. So everything inland wasn't named. Everything that was on the beach around the island was named. So they attack up the Hogback. As I previously mentioned, the weather on Attu is just as much of an enemy as the Japanese, and Jones and his men have trouble operating in the fog. But the fog that caused them so much trouble was also a little bit of a blessing at times, as we're going to hear from Jones now. Can we play video clip number 2, please?
But the fog there is horrendous. But the fog saved a lot of lives because of the way it worked up there in that atmosphere. We went up a hog's back with a mountain that was within rifle distance, 300, 400 yards, even to its top. The Japanese were dug in up there somewhere around the 300 or 400 foot level. And every time the fog would come down, they couldn't see us. We were totally exposed. There wasn't a tree on the island, not a tree on the island. No place for cover and concealment, which we as infantry need to have for protection. So every time the fog would lift up, they would open up on us, and we lost an awful lot of boys killed that way as compared to face-to-face, hand-to-hand combat. When that fog that I told you, that fog would come down to 75 or 100 feet from the side of the mountain that we had to contend with for about the first 6-8 days. It would come down, and we could move around, in relative safety. But then, when that fog would raise, we'd be doing something, or a mass of us would be doing something else, and all of a sudden that fog would raise up slow for about 10 or 12 minutes. It'd go up to the 300, 400, 500 foot level, and when it did, they could see us, and that's when they fired on us. So anyhow, we went on, and we finally subdued them. We lost 579 men on that too, killed, and a great portion of them were killed by snipers because they were always within. Well, we were out in the open, and they were hid by the fog, and we couldn't see them. They had white jackets on in the snow-covered mountains, and they had built their strong points so that they had filled up a barrier in front of the opening in the tunnel, so that from down here you couldn't see in it and see that was where the tunnel was. And consequently, between that and the fog, we had difficulty getting them out of there. But finally, with the aid of our 37 millimeter guns and our artillery and naval fire, we finally got them out of there. We had very little air support because of the fog, and 2 or 3 planes crashed as a result of the fog, and so they couldn't support us too well with air. But,
So also landing with the Southern Landing Force at Massacre Bay and experiencing Attu's wonderful weather with around the same location that Jones is Lieutenant Stanley Wolchek and his platoon from Company G, 32nd Infantry Regiment, who landed on the opposite side of Massacre Valley from where Bill Jones landed. After going ashore, they began moving in parallel to Jones's outfit. And as they moved inland, Wolchek and his men found that fighting in the valleys was even more difficult than fighting in the ridges. And in this clip, we're going to hear Mr. Wolchek describing fighting in the valleys and his experience of being fired on for the first time. Can we have clip number 3, please?
Well, in the valleys was terrible. I mean, the first time we were in the valleys and they began shooting. I remember the first time they were firing an aircraft weapon at us, five shells at a time, you know. And we were digging in the valley. Well, that was no way to. As soon as you dug, your hole filled with water. Well, you can't very well sit in that darn thing. I remember putting my elbows into the dumb water and my knees so I wouldn't be fully into it until we moved into the areas where we had chances to get behind stones, rocks, and so forth. But the valley was terrible in that respect. They had us over the barrel in that you couldn't dig and expect anything because digging didn't do you any good. They were creating another problem. So the weather, we learned slowly that we can move in the fog. It's all foggy every day. And as it lifted, be sure you were in a position that you can hide behind and focus on your objective. So that was a thing we learned quickly.
So there's that Aleutian Islands fog again. Well, several days into the battle, while fighting in the ridge above Wolchek's position, Jones' squad leader was hit and wounded, and Jones was chosen to take his position as squad leader. Now, Jones had impressed his superiors with his actions, even though he had never even had a day of infantry training prior to landing on Attu. I think he had gone on a couple of 20-mile hikes in the days before the 7th Division shipped out of California and went to Alaska, but that was the extent of it. Over the following days, Jones and his squad moved through Massacre Valley toward Clavesi Pass. Most of the time, Jones was simply acting in concert with other squads. So while he's leading his men, he's not actually issuing the instructions that are causing them to move. These directions are coming from higher up. But then one day, Jones is ordered to knock out a Japanese position. And he wasn't given any direct orders on how to do it. He was just told there's an enemy strong point here, take your squad and knock it out. So this is going to be the first time that he is directing his men on his own. And it's also the first time that he lost a man as a result of enemy action, also as a result of orders that he had given. And for this clip, I do apologize for the quality of the audio. Jones lived in a house with a metal roof in Florida, and it rained off and on the entire day that I was visiting with him. And I guess since we were there talking about Attu, with its awful weather, Mother Nature was providing us with some awful weather in Florida while I was doing the interview. But if we could we play clip number 4, please?
Before we left the United States, our government, sometime in early 1943, had passed a law that if you were 38 years old, under certain circumstances, you could get out of the service. So I took over this squad, and as I said, the first action that I worked independently, most of the time we worked with other squads, on an attack or some nature. But the first time that I worked independently, I was given the objective of taking this machine gun position. And as I said earlier, in the book, Manual for Leadership, it states that the leader is supposed to be in such a position where he can control the greater portion of his men. And that naturally has to be behind them, because you can see them all the time. So I was right on line with them or close to them. I had learned all of my men's names by that time. And of course we lost them, and then we get refills, filler personnel comes in. But anyhow, the first man, the way we maneuver in the infantry, usually we have cover and concealment. And I'll give an order to a couple of guys to move forward, and while they're moving, the rest of the guys are firing on the enemy to hold them down so these two won't have a lot of fire on them. And it just so happened I called this old gentleman's name, Gonzalez his name was, and him and another fellow. And as he went up there, he fell down and he had been shot. And I called a couple more, and I'm continuing to move up, and I look and see that he's down, and he hollered and told me that he'd been shot. And of course, everybody was laying down that I moved forward. And so I told him to take his sulfur pill, and I seen him taking those, and I didn't see him use his canteen. His canteen was kind of way back in the back, and along with everything else, moving men and so forth, I told him to make sure he took the pill with your water. And he says, I can't reach my canteen. Well, by this time I'm putting her up to him. I forget whether I took his canteen or handed him mine. When I did, he dropped it. He was dead. He'd got hit in the groin, and severely. And he bled to death that fast. And that night they asked me to, came up and told me to send him back to the rear. And they got his discharge came through. Or no, his paperwork came through. And he was going to go home and be discharged. And it's a little rough. So he had 7 children. Even at 19 years old or 20 years old, that's you know what I mean?
So as we can see, the loss of this gentleman deeply affected Jones at the time that it occurred, and it affected him all the way until the end of his life. Jones passed away several years ago. But even though losses were suffered, the battle continued on. Japanese troops that were dug in all over the ridges on the eastern half of Attu. The entire Battle of Attu was fought on the eastern half of the island. The Japanese had to be dug out at countless nooks and crannies, using rifles and bayonets and hand grenades and anti-tank guns, field artillery, naval gunfire support, just any way that they could be gotten out. And the cost of taking these ridges was very high. The fighting was high, the battles were high on both sides, or the casualties suffered during those battles were high on both sides. A few days before the Battle of Attu comes to an end, Stan Walczyk is moving his platoon up the frozen ridges of Prendergast Ridge. Prendergast Ridge runs straight into Chichagof Harbor. So the plan is to turn on Prendergast Ridge. The Southern Landing Forces and the Northern Landing Forces are going to meet there and drive in to wipe out the last remnants of the Japanese. Well, as Walczyk is leading his men up Prendergast Ridge, he comes across a dying American soldier. And this is one of the produced pieces, which I mentioned earlier. There is going to be some archival film footage that is in this video, as well as some narration. But we can see Walczyk's experience when he encounters this American soldier. Could we please play video clip number 5?
Stan Walczyk was a platoon leader with the 7th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, stationed on the American island of Attu, off the coast of Alaska. In May of 1943, the United States attempted to retake the island which had been under Japanese occupation since 1942. In the midst of battle, Wilczek came upon a mortally wounded U.S. soldier.
He was coughing something terrible, and he was spitting blood all over. His whole chest was covered. And I thought to myself, geez, the worst is yet to come, because he's going to feel lonesome. Because when you die by yourself, no matter what. Now, what can we do to help? So I reached over, and I grasped his hand, and I gave it a squeeze to assure him that he was not alone. He acknowledged my presence by squeezing my hand. And then he died. Well, I left him, and I moved forward. We're on a fairly steep mountain side, and there was firing from my left, so I spotted my target, and I fired a couple rounds and began to reload, bringing my rifle down, and that's when I was wounded. I'm getting cold all over now. When I thought to myself, geez, this is how persons die. You get cold all over. So I decided, well, as long as I'm going to die, I might as well lower my head and close my eyes so I look pretty when those people picked me up.
Wilczek was eventually rescued by 2 advancing American soldiers. While Wilczek survived, the casualties from the Battle of Attu Island were remarkably high. In the end, nearly 4,000 Americans were injured or killed.
So Wilczek was evacuated from Attu back to the United States. He spent over a year in various hospitals recovering from his wounds. He'd been shot in the back multiple times, not by somebody behind him, but by somebody in the ridges above him that was shooting down. For Wilczek, the war was over. He was separated from service in 1944 and did not serve overseas again. For the other 2 veterans that we're hearing from today, Bill Jones, who we've already heard from, and Joseph Sasser, who we will hear from in a few moments, bad times were still yet to come. The fight was not over yet. Early on the morning of May 29th, the Battle of Attu is going to come to a frightening, violent, vicious end in the form of a massive Japanese Banzai attack. Every living Japanese soldier, almost every living Japanese soldier who's in any condition to wield a weapon is going to take part in this Banzai attack of about 1,000 people. Now, roughly half of the 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment, which was positioned in the middle of Chichagof Valley, which was the front lines at this point, excuse me, they get orders early on the morning of May 29th to march to the rear, that there is a field kitchen that's preparing breakfast for them. For many of the guys who are heading back to this field kitchen, it's going to be the first hot meal they have had in 18 days. However, only a half a mile or so from where these guys are now heading to the rear, the remaining 1,000 or so Japanese on Attu kick off the final assault of the battle. Japanese troops move very quietly through the fog. They actually get through the American front lines without being detected. Excuse me. After penetrating the American lines, the Japanese force becomes a little dispersed or fragmented. Some of the Japanese troops, or most of the Japanese troops, continue on toward a terrain feature that we now refer to as Engineer Hill, which is going to be the site of the last Battle of Attu. Some of the Japanese soldiers actually find themselves in the site of one of the 7th Infantry Divisions, or one of the 7th Medical Battalion's medical clearing companies. The Japanese troops quickly engage and eliminate the medics, doctors, and other support personnel in the medical clearing company. Few of the American troops who were in the medical clearing company, including the wounded infantrymen, were armed, so it was not much of a fight. One of the men present during this action, though, was Bill Jones, who we've heard from this morning. He had been wounded for the fourth time the previous day. He had been shot through the leg. Not long before that, he had been hit in the cheek with a piece of shrapnel that had actually broken one of his teeth, and that was causing him a lot of problems as well. So while he was in the clearing company, excuse me, he had had his leg tended to, and he had had the fractured tooth removed. And while he's recovering and waiting to be evacuated off the island, the Japanese show up. Can we play clip number 6, please?
We had a hospital clearing station up on a hill, which was finally named Engineer Hill. Engineer Hill has 3 plateaus to it. It has a peak, which isn't too large, maybe 30 yards, with a diameter of about 30 or 40 yards. And then it has a plateau. Well, down on this plateau was the hospital clearing station with several tents, and 3 of them housed wounded personnel. And 2 of those tents, the Japanese pulled the pins and shot and bayoneted, pardon me, shot and bayoneted all the men that were in those 2 tents. And then the 3rd tent, I just happened to be in that, and I was very fortunate. One man got killed in that tent, but the reason he got killed was a stray bullet happened to go through the tent and shot him through the head.
What those wounded men in that medical clearing company must have gone through or endured is unimaginable. As Jones said, the Japanese troops threw hand grenades into the 2 outside tents. The tents were set up 3 in a row, and the 2 outside tents were the 2 that the Japanese grenaded. They even set one of the tents on fire with American casualties still inside and burned it down, burning them to death. They also entered the other tent and went cot to cot, bayoneting all of the wounded soldiers. Jones and the, I believe, 17 others who were in the middle tent survived only because one of the wounded officers who was in the tent had the wherewithal to pick up the casualty that Jones mentioned, the man who had been shot in the head by the stray bullet. This officer picked that guy up and laid his body in the doorway to the tent. And several Japanese soldiers, seeing the body in the doorway, thought that the tent was a morgue tent. So there is this wherewithal to place that body in the tent. That helps. These guys are also protected by a lot of luck, because most of the Japanese, just like I said, bypassed it thinking it was a morgue. But one Japanese soldier was pretty curious and wanted to see what was inside, and was actually stepping over the body into the tent when he either was called from behind or he heard something that caught his attention from behind. He quickly glanced around in the darkness, didn't see anything moving, I guess was satisfied that there was nothing still alive in there, and he leaves. The Japanese, or after killing most of the wounded, obviously not the Jones and the other 17 in the center tent, this group of Japanese makes its way back to the base of Engineer Hill, where it regroups with the rest of the Japanese assault force. The Japanese then begin attacking up Engineer Hill at about 5 o'clock in the morning on May 29th, 1943. There, they are stopped cold by a hastily formed line of engineers, cooks, clerks, anyone capable of picking up and firing a rifle, including Brigadier General Archibald Arnold, who was the assistant division commander of the 7th Infantry Division. He had his division command post set up, or his command post set up on top of Engineer Hill. And many soldiers that were on top of Engineer Hill testified to seeing General Arnold right there in the thick of the fighting with him. One of those men who was up on top of Engineer Hill fighting the Japanese that morning was Joseph Sasser, who served with the 50th Engineer Combat Regiment. He was sound asleep when the attack began. This piece that we're going to see about Sasser, talking about the final Banzai attack on Engineer Hill, this is also one of the produced pieces, so we'll have some other, some archival video footage and some narration with it. But if we could see clip number 7, please.
Joseph Sasser, a soldier with the 50th Engineer Combat Regiment, U.S. Army, was stationed on the American island of Attu off the coast of Alaska. He was positioned on what became known as Engineer Hill when the Japanese troops attacked in a desperate and frenzied Banzai charge.
It came in at early. It was in the dark. There were 3 of us in one pup tent. Somebody came through, said, "The Japs have broken through. Get up." And everybody got up. Luckily, we had pitched our tent where the ravine crested up Engineer Hill. So we boiled out of that thing and we moved on up on the embankment there that the engineers had built alongside the road. And that's where we took refuge. And if you didn't have your boots on, you came like you were. And if I'd have been cold, I probably wouldn't have known it anyhow with the excitement and everything, because it was bedlam. You can't imagine, because these Japs were stacked on top of each other down in the ravine. And that first spot where we had put our tent, there were 2 guys that moved in and set up exactly where we were, and they were stabbed in the sack right there. And that's how close I came. That was some kind of day.
Despite its ferocity, the attack was unsuccessful, and the Americans held control of Attu Island. Casualties were high on both sides. Led by Colonel Yasuyo Yamazaki, the Japanese who survived the assault killed themselves in ritual suicide.
So that fight that Sasser is talking about was the final assault carried out by the remaining Japanese forces on Attu. Knowing that they could not defeat the Americans in open combat, the Japanese had attempted the longest of long shots. They planned to attack out of the area of Chichagof Harbor to across the valley floor to the high ground on top of Engineer Hill. There they knew that there was American artillery batteries up there, so they planned to kill the artillerymen manning those batteries. Then they were going to turn the guns on the American troops that were on the island. After firing, I don't know how many rounds they planned to fire, but then they were going to continue their attack down toward Massacre Bay, where the primary American supply dumps were located. There is only about as I mentioned earlier, there was only about a 4-mile distance between Massacre Bay and Chichagof Harbor as the crow flies, because much of that is mountains and valleys and mountains and valleys. But the Japanese were going to fight their way to Massacre Bay to the American supply dumps. Once they got into that area, because they had nothing, most of these Japanese soldiers didn't even have ammunition. They were just fighting with bayonets. So they would have been like kids in a shopping mall with mom and dad's credit card, grabbing food and ammunition and weapons and whatever other supplies that they needed, medication especially as well. They were then going to destroy the rest of the supplies on the beachhead. They figured that if the Americans didn't have any supplies, that they couldn't fight, and may even be put in the position where they would have to leave Attu, and the Japanese would hold the island and win. Unfortunately for Colonel Yamazaki and his men, very little of the Japanese plan actually succeeded. The first assault on Engineer Hill was stopped in its tracks. The Japanese fell back a few hundred yards. They regrouped and attacked up the hill again a second time. This time, Colonel Yamazaki is killed either by rifle or grenade fire. I think he was shot. The Japanese then fell back again, and at this point, realizing that it's over, the remaining 500 or so Japanese soldiers fall back down to the base of Engineer Hill and commit suicide to the man. Sasser later told me after the interview that I conducted with him that during this battle, he just kept firing his rifle and firing his rifle. And he had no idea if he hit anybody or anything, but he wasn't going to stop shooting until the fight was over. So that was it. The Battle of Attu was over. As the sun came up on 29 May 1943, the Americans conducted some patrol operations, but that was it. The battle's done. The cost to take the island, since we're on Memorial Day, and we are talking also about human cost. As Jones mentioned earlier, there were 579 American soldiers killed on Attu. There were approximately 1,200 wounded, and about twice that suffering from exposure-related injuries, from frostbite, from frozen feet, which was rampant because most of the guys didn't have proper equipment when they landed. And that number only reflects losses suffered by the Army. The Army Air Forces and the Navy both suffered as well. With regards to the number of troops involved, the number of casualties suffered by the Army on Attu was second only to the casualties suffered by the Marines on Iwo Jima. With regards to the number of people involved, the Battle of Attu was the second most costly battle the United States fought during World War II. Losses on the Japanese side were even higher. All but 28 of the 2,400-man garrison on Attu perished. And that is it for my presentation today. We do have a few minutes for some questions. See, Tom K is asking about books about the Battle of Attu. Brian Garfield's The 1,000-Mile War is a very good one. The National Park Service has actually put out a booklet on the Battle of Attu as well, which is also very good. Let's see. So Mark S is asking, what were the temperatures on the island and how big was it? So the temperatures on Attu hovered between about 10 degrees overnight and about 42 degrees during the daytime. And temperatures can be a little tricky. Growing up down here in the South where we have pretty bad humidity, you know that when you add humidity to either very hot or very cold temperatures, it just makes them worse. And the humidity on Attu made those, everything's wet, and it just made those temperatures feel even colder than they were. Michelle W asks, was there ever a movie made about this? So not a cinematic movie, but there have been a couple of very, very good documentaries made about the Battle of Attu. Red, White, Black, and Blue is a good one. And Cradle of Storms is another good one. And if you watch either of those, you will see a familiar face. Bill Jones was in both of those. Let's see, Jim W is asking if the Japanese attempted any kind of resupply or counterattack during the battle. Was the U.S. Navy prepared for that? The Japanese had stopped trying to reinforce or resupply the Attu garrison prior to the battle starting. The U.S. Navy had a presence there, and in the days before the battle, the Japanese just gave up trying to either get their men off the island or resupply them. Jim K asked, what, if anything, is located on Attu? That is a great question. There is nothing. There was a U.S. Coast Guard LORAN station. It was long-range navigation station, and that closed several years ago, and there is nothing there now, maybe a handful of Arctic foxes, and that's about it. There are no people. John is asking what happened at Kiska. So in August of '43, the U.S. Army lands the Kiska Task Force, which is a combined American and Canadian task force on Kiska. About 300 or 350 casualties are suffered retaking the island, even though there was not one Japanese soldier present when the Allies get there. The Japanese had evacuated the island before the Allies arrived, and the Allies didn't realize that, and in a number of cases ended up shooting at each other, and many men were killed. Let's see, a school question that says, why weren't the inhabitants of Attu allowed to return after the war? I don't know. First of all, there weren't many of them. There were only about 20 that had survived captivity in Japan, and honestly, I don't know. Again, the National Park Service has done pretty extensive writings on the Aleutian Islands, so that's where I would look for this. And let's see, we'll do one more question. David H, were the 1st Special Service Force involved in the Battle of Attu? No, they were not. They were involved in the Battle of Kiska. That was That's where they were involved, but they were not at Attu. So that's going to be it for this morning. Thank you all so very much for joining me. And make sure to check back tomorrow to see what we have.